Okay, guys, so what I wanted to do here is just kind of review the last two possible things that could be asked about in regards to some short answer or essay questions on your test. So if you remember, there's four possibilities. There was the one with ossification, intramembranous, and endochondral. There was bone growth, which was both in length and the appositional, or the widening of the bone. So those are possibilities. And then there was bone remodeling and types of fractures and fracture repair. So additionally, I just wanted to make one other note. So the test will cover, you guys need to focus on sections 6.1 through 6.6. And then there's two questions that I did ask. I left on because I did not ask them on the practical. But I just want to let you know in advance. So there's two questions on a test that I ask about the curvature of the vertebral column. So that information is found on pages 162 and 163. So just make sure that you take a look at that because like I said, there's two questions about development and curvature of the vertebral column, okay? So while we're looking at this now, what we see up here is bone remodeling. So I have been talking about this basically since the beginning of the chapter when I was talking about some of the bone markings and how they might be more pronounced in some bones than others. And I kind of talked about the bone marking on the back of the femur called the linea aspera, which is the attachment point for your hamstring muscles. So if the hamstrings are more developed and defined, then that line will be more pronounced because of the greater pull on the bone. Okay, so for bone remodeling, we're really looking at a couple things here. So we're looking at, it's the process by which the bone is going to reorganize, break down, and rebuild bone matrix. So we know that osteocytes are your typical mature adult bone cells. So they're going to be involved in the process of maintaining that matrix balance. So remember, it's kind of dictated by blood calcium levels and by stresses placed on the bone. So if you have low blood calcium levels, that basically means that calcium from your bones, from the calcium phosphate apatite matrix, will need to be broken down and released back into the bloodstream. If blood calcium levels are high and or additional stresses, and I use the term mechanical stress, so things like pressure, weight, the forces and rigors of exercise that those place on the bone, that's going to cause the bones to thicken. So when we talked about how bones grow in width, we said that as they grow wider, they keep that aspect ratio between the medullary cavity, the diameter of that, and the diameter of the outside kind of stays, it's the same ratio. So basically both get bigger at the same rate. But if the bone is remodeling, then due to stresses, so I use the example of runners. So if we looked at the legs, the leg bones, the femurs, the tibias of a runner, we would see that their bones are actually going to have a thicker aspect ratio there because of the fact that more bone will be deposited to the outside, to the periosteum. It'll be deposited faster than bone matrix is broken down in the endosteum. So that means that it's going to become thicker so that it's stronger so that it can handle that mechanical stress. So we do see our three bone cell types there: osteocytes, osteoclasts, and osteoblasts listed. So we just need to make sure we know what they do, okay? When we look at how this takes place, so as these things continue to change, so again, it'll be dictated by your diet, it'll be dictated by how your body absorbs nutrients. So all of those things will kind of play a role in figuring out how much or where your bones are going to be remodeled. The ones that are most heavily stressed will be the thickest. So we see there with how exercise kind of affects that. And when we become inactive, or bones that aren't used, and we see this a lot of times when a bone is broken and it's casted, in addition to muscle atrophy, the bone itself will be thinner and weaker at first. It will eventually build back up to its normal once it gets used and put back under its normal amount of stress. Okay. So now let's look at fractures. So in your book, there is a page that deals with fractures, and it has the different fracture types. So that is one of the major things. How I would ask this in terms of question is I usually sort of give you an example, like a situation, and you would have to tell me what type of break or what type of fracture occurred. So these are found, it's a big 2-page layout. It's page 150 and 151. So there's two major categories. So closed fractures are the ones where it's what we typically think of. The bone gets broken. We don't really see it, but you use an x-ray and you can determine it. And then there's open or compound fractures, and those are the ones where the bones are not only broken, but it actually breaks the skin's surface. So basically it's exposed, so the bones are sticking out from the skin. So obviously there's lots more danger with that. It's harder to reset, harder in terms of healing. Definitely going to be looking at pins and plates and rods and things like that to kind of fix those, as well as having to deal with higher risk of infection. Okay, so then there are some common types. So there's the transverse fracture. These ones, and when you look, the book does a really nice job of putting x-ray images of these so you can kind of see exactly what it's like. So the transverse, displaced, non-displaced, compression, spiral's more of like a twisting motion. Compression, we tend to see these in things like vertebra, stuff like that, where there can be pressure from top and bottom placed on it. The epiphyseal ones, obviously it's going to be near where the epiphyseal plates are, so in like the epiphyses of the bones. Comminuted, that basically kind of means that it's like crushed into little pieces, and then so you end up with these little fragments inside. Green stick is one. This is very common in children. So when you think of like a twig, not being like, if you try to snap a twig and it won't snap directly through because it kind of almost like peels because the wood is still green. So that's where the term green stick comes from. And then your Colles fracture is one of those ones that we typically see when you try to brace yourself from a fall. So it's one of the ones that are common, like wrist. When you hear somebody say they broke their wrist, that's usually what we see or what we're talking about. So there's 4 steps to repair for this. As we can kind of see here. So the first step there, a hematoma is basically where it's like a blood-filled, almost like a sac kind of thing. So we figure your bone is vascular. So when you break the bone, you're going to be rupturing some blood vessels as well. As that starts to leak, the clotting cascade is going to kick in. So in other words, your blood's going to be told those are going to start clotting, and it's going to form this blood-filled space called the hematoma. And that's going to be like the initial part of healing. So it sort of seals everything in. It kind of creates almost like a capsule where this hematoma is. So, there will be swelling and pain and everything associated with that because there will be nerve damage in there as well. Then the second step, what's going to happen is around that site where the bone is broken, you're going to have 2 calluses form. So by callus, don't think of what we think of when we think of your skin as being callus. This is basically what it is. It's like a scaffold. So the first scaffolding that's going to get laid down will be spongy bone and or cartilage. So it's going to be, the purpose will be to connect the parts that are broken. And then the external callus or cartilage, so this is going to be mostly cartilage and then some bone matrix, will kind of stabilize the outside. So the external callus is kind of like a splint, and the internal callus is kind of like connecting, it's like a bridge connecting the 2 broken pieces together. All right. Once that scaffolding, that internal bridge with the external splint is formed, then what we'll have is new bone cells, osteoblasts, will start laying down new bone matrix all along that scaffolding, and eventually the scaffolding will be filled in and will get converted back. So you see there's step number 4, is it'll go from spongy to compact bone. So once that finally heals, then we're kind of done with that. I do ask, so this kind of goes along with the bone remodeling. So obviously everything we talk about with aging is that aging pretty much is detrimental to whatever body system we're talking about. So there's 2 terms that I wanted you to know here. So osteopenia is one, and this is like the normal thing that happens with aging where the bones become weaker. Now that's because of a couple reasons. So if we're looking at these, so this will start after around age 30. No age joke comments here. So obviously you see they're between ages 30 and 40. So yeah, this is going on for me. So what you have is you have basically a slowing down of everything. So the activity of the cells themselves, so you don't have, since cells are growing and dividing slower, osteoblasts, those building cells, those stem cells, those immature cells, don't have the ability to build up as quickly. But the osteoclasts, which are already mature cells, they're still going to operate at the same rate. So you basically have bone matrix being broken down faster than it's being rebuilt. So you see there, it's worse in women than it is in men, and part of that is due to difference like hormonal changes. So we'll see that especially with onset of menopause. Male hormones tend to not affect the skeleton as much as the female hormones do. So that's another reason for that. So don't confuse osteopenia with osteoporosis. So osteoporosis is more of actual kind of like a disorder. So this is not due to normal aging. So this would be when the osteopenia kind of goes to the extreme and kind of gets worse than normal. And this, again, so it's more common in women. It's going to leave the bones a little bit more porous, which makes them more brittle, which makes them easier to break. There is a genetic component to this, so that's one of the other issues with it. Okay, so you can see here all the things that kind of go with this in terms of leading to more possible fractures. You see there, so women after menopause. So if you notice things where it says they're due to a decline in circulating estrogen, so remember for men, because men, your testosterone levels drop, which means that your estrogen levels actually rise a little bit. So that's actually why this is not as much of an issue for men as it is for women. Okay? So I hope that kind of makes sense to you. If you have any additional questions about either of these things before the test, please come see me or message me and I'll gladly answer them. Okay?